Israel is a country that is very much gripped by a sense of collective grief over these six young hostages who were executed by Hamas very short time before they could have been rescued by Israel. But it's also a country that is very much wrapped up in a sense of fury and anger over the fact that these hostages perhaps could have been saved had a deal for their release been completed ahead of time. And so you've seen hundreds of thousands of Israelis pour into the streets of this country, angry at the government, calling for it to immediately enact a deal, to perhaps relax its own requirements and its demands in its negotiations with Hamas in order to bring as many of those hostages home as quickly as they possibly can.
What sense is there in terms of percentages? How many people out on the streets are protesting against the government, and how many are simply showing solidarity with the families of hostages?
Well, I would say that that distinction has largely been lost at this point. Many of the protests for the families of the hostages have become anti-government protests as the perception has grown that certain elements within the government are standing in the way of a hostage deal that would see those young people released. And so we have a large segment of society that is in fact participating either actively or passively in those protests. But there is, of course, another parallel stream of thought within Israeli society that says any concession at this point will imperil Israel's security and will further encourage Hamas to engage in acts like October the 7th, take additional hostages, and gain additional concessions from Israel. And so those two forces are very much in opposition to one another, and you see this playing out in the streets of Israel today. Look, it's certainly true that discord in Israeli society is in many respects to the benefit of Hamas. Hamas loves seeing this country torn apart. That was a situation that existed before October 7th, and there are many who suggest that it was the discord and disunity in this country that encouraged Hamas to carry out the massacre of that day. But what we've seen over the past few months is coming together of Israeli society in solidarity and support for one another, but that's starting to fray. Now, the question is whether that cost is worth ultimately bringing those hostages home, right? The hope of the protesters is to apply as much pressure as possible to the government to make whatever concessions are necessary to bring those hostages back. But of course, it comes at the cost of projecting the sense of internal weakness, which could have very detrimental effects down the line.
And some of those concessions will be the release of terrorist murderers who are being held in Israeli prisons. And that potentially, whilst being morally difficult for people to stomach, it also is a potential security threat. And that is one of the major considerations. By making a concession, does that make Israel weaker or stronger?
Well, that is certainly a point of contention in this country. We know, for example, that Yahya Sinwar, the leader of Hamas in Gaza, who was the mastermind behind the October 7th, was himself released as part of a previous exchange for a single soldier named Gilad Shalit several years ago, who was one of 1,000 convicted Palestinian terrorists who were released at that time. And of course, he not only went back to the circle of terror, he perpetrated the greatest massacre of Jews since the Holocaust. So there are significant concerns within Israeli society that any terrorist released as part of this deal could themselves contribute to additional bloodshed in the future. But for many Israelis, that is a price they're willing to pay to immediately bring back as many of the living hostages as we possibly can in order to avoid other tragedies like we've seen over the past couple of days. I think you have both sides jockeying for the best possible deal that they can get. At the moment, there is tremendous pressure on Israel internally to bring about some kind of a deal. And that, of course, works to Hamas's favor because it can then gain certain concessions that perhaps it wouldn't have been able to just a few days ago. We know there's also international pressure from the United States and other countries to come about, to bring about this kind of a deal as quickly as possible. We also do know that Hamas is under internal pressure to have a deal of its own. We know that Yahya Sinwar's own men, the fighters of Hamas, the terrorists who are engaging in battle with Israel, are telling him, we cannot sustain this level of warfare anymore. We need a break. and therefore we need to have a ceasefire for our own purposes. Of course, the people of Gaza, I'm sure, would love to have a ceasefire in order to improve their humanitarian situation in the weeks and months ahead. So there is pressure coming from various different sides. The question is, what will it take? What will be the tipping point that will bring those two sides to a place where they can actually sign a deal? The Philadelphia Corridor is essentially the land border between the Gaza Strip and the Sinai, which of course is controlled by Egypt. And we know that for years now, that territory, which is extremely porous, has been used by Hamas to import arms, such as those that were used on October 7th, money, and smuggle people back and forth as well. So Israel is insisting that its current control of that land area will continue in some way or another in order to prevent those smuggling attempts to continue in the future. We know, for example, that they've uncovered a large number of tunnels, many more than they had anticipated they would even find, that have apparently been used for those purposes. So they say they need to maintain some kind of presence, some kind of control in that area to prevent it from being used for those purposes in the future. Hamas, of course, wants to retain the ability to import or to smuggle in arms, individuals, and money at will. And so it is opposed to any Israeli presence in that land. And it's important to know that Egypt as well is opposed to any continued Israeli presence there. They view it as an infringement on their sovereignty and essentially an Israeli declaration of no confidence in their own ability to control their border. The reality is that they have not done a particularly good job of controlling their border. And so that remains a point of contention. There have been various different solutions that have been proposed, perhaps putting a certain number of Israeli watchtowers, but having the actual territory controlled by some kind of international force. That is one option that apparently is on the table, but we've yet to see agreement on that very important point in this negotiation.
Is there a sense that Israeli forces are getting closer to the head of the snake, Yahya Sinwar, and that time is running out for the Hamas leadership?
Well, there are certainly suggestions that one of the reasons that Yahya Sinwar and the leadership of Hamas have been somewhat more forthcoming in recent months is that they feel the noose tightening around their own necks, and that Israel, in fact, is drawing nearer to their own hideouts under Gaza and the tunnel network that they have constructed. But we don't know exactly when that will happen. We do know that he has requested some kind of immunity, basically that Israel commit to not killing him if this agreement is signed. I would say that Israel should absolutely sign that and then kill him anyway. But the bottom line is that the reality is closing in on the leaders of Hamas, and they are feeling the pressure both from their own people, from the fact that they cannot import or smuggle in arms and money and individuals like they have in the past, and realizing that Israel does appear to be closing in. And so it looks like we are drawing closer in some way to reaching some kind of a deal. The question again, though, is what it's going to take for both those sides to get whatever they feel they absolutely need and bring that deal about. It is unlikely that anyone in the security sources is going to strike. That's not generally a part of these kinds of actions. However, Israel's largest workers' union has declared a general strike in this country. Various companies and industries have said that they will join along. There are others, by the way, who have said they are not going to join along, in both cases largely according to political lines. But what we're likely to see is some kind of lessening of services in this country, at least for today. We don't know if it's going to extend any further. We don't know whether the court is going to intervene, as the government has asked it to do. We do anticipate that hundreds of thousands of Israelis are going to pour into the streets of this country and call for an immediate deal to bring about the release, the return of those hostages. And in many cases, we'll also be calling for the ouster of this current government. Israeli politics are notably fluid. And so even if one individual, one politician seems to be riding high at the moment, that doesn't necessarily mean that when push comes to shove and when the polls actually open, that individual is going to see those gains. But we have seen, as you said, Naftali Bennett, the former prime minister, doing quite well in the polls, even though he's not currently a part of the political system at all. He's not in Knesset, in parliament. He's not in government, certainly. But it does seem as though his star is on the rise. Whereas Benny Gantz, the former minister who had been a part of the emergency coalition, does not seem to be doing as well today as he had been previously. There are various reasons why that might be. I think many Israelis feel that Israel needs some kind of a right-wing, right-oriented leader, which Naftali Bennett is viewed as being. But there, as you said, is, I think, a great deal of consternation in this country around the leadership of Benjamin Netanyahu, And so they're starting to look for some kind of alternative. It looks like Naftali Bennett is the only one on the scene at the moment. Now, again, there's no election that is immediately on the horizon. And it's certainly possible that once one is called, other players will emerge from the ether and another leader for the right-wing camp may emerge. But at the moment, that is the situation, and we don't know what's going to happen in the months ahead.